My name is James Rohn, and what I'm about to show you is the night a billionaire's wife was humiliated as a nobody waitress, and the woman who destroyed her had no idea she'd just ruined her own life in front of the one man who could end her with a single phone call. Grace Carter had worked at the Crescent Palace Hotel for nearly 4 years, and in that time she had become something of a quiet legend among the staff, not because she demanded attention but because she never sought any at all. She treated the dishwasher with the same warmth she gave to the wealthiest guest at the bar, and she remembered the names of every bellhop, every janitor, every line cook who passed through those gilded halls. What none of them knew, what not a single coworker could have guessed, was that Grace had once signed her name on checks worth more than the entire hotel itself. She had been married for 6 years to Nathaniel Brooks, a man whose technology company had reshaped an entire industry and whose fortune placed him among the youngest billionaires in the country. Together they had quietly built children's hospitals, funded scholarships for kids who could never otherwise dream of college, and donated more money to struggling families than most charities raised in a decade. But Grace had made a decision early in their marriage that she would never let her husband's wealth define how she understood the world. She wanted to know what it felt like to be dismissed, to be overlooked, to be judged by a uniform instead of a bank account. So several nights a month, without telling anyone at those events who she truly was, she pinned back her hair, put on a plain white blouse, and carried trays of champagne through rooms full of people who would never imagine the woman refilling their glasses could buy the building they stood in. That night, the Crescent Palace was hosting one of the most talked about charity galas of the year. The guest list read like a who's who of New York's elite, financiers, politicians, actors, and journalists all gathered beneath crystal chandeliers to celebrate a cause while quietly celebrating themselves. At the center of it all was Michael Harrison, a rising corporate power player, and beside him walked Vanessa Reed, his girlfriend, a woman more famous for her jewelry collection and her social media following than for anything she had ever built or earned. Vanessa had a way of walking into a room like she owned it, expecting waitstaff to move like furniture and guests to admire her like art. Grace had served hundreds of people like Vanessa before, and she had learned to let their arrogance slide off her like rain, never taking it personally, never letting it steal her peace. She believed, deeply and quietly, that a person's true character revealed itself not in how they treated people who could help them, but in how they treated people who could not. That belief was about to be tested in front of an entire ballroom, in a moment that would end up being filmed, shared, and remembered by millions of people who had never even attended a single charity gala in their lives, because sometimes the most powerful stories are not written by wealth or status, but by the quiet dignity of someone who refuses to disappear even when the whole world seems determined to make her feel small. The accident itself lasted less than 3 seconds. A guest, distracted by conversation, brushed against Grace's shoulder just as she was passing the VIP table, causing a single glass of sparkling water to tip and spill a few scattered drops onto the corner of Vanessa's designer handbag. It was the kind of accident that happens a dozen times a night at any event with hundreds of people and dozens of servers weaving between tables, the kind of thing usually resolved with a napkin, an apology, and a shared laugh. Grace immediately set down her tray, apologized sincerely, and offered to have the bag cleaned by the hotel's finest service at no cost. For most people, that would have been the end of it. But Vanessa was not most people. She stood up so abruptly her chair scraped loudly against the marble floor, and her voice rose to a volume that silenced every conversation within 30 feet. She held up the bag as though it had been destroyed, accusing Grace of carelessness, of incompetence, of not understanding the value of the things wealthy people owned. Grace apologized again, lowering her eyes, choosing calm over confrontation, believing as she always had that dignity spoke louder than argument ever could. But her composure only seemed to enrage Vanessa further. She began mocking the plain black and white uniform Grace wore, sneering at her modest shoes, suggesting loudly that people who worked jobs like this simply did not understand what it meant to build something, to earn something, to matter. Around them, guests began to notice, some pulling out their phones under the table, others simply staring in uncomfortable silence, no one quite willing to step into the path of a woman dating one of the room's most powerful men. Then, in a moment that would replay in the minds of everyone present for years afterward, Vanessa reached forward and grabbed the front of Grace's uniform, yanking with such force that the buttons scattered across the floor like tiny white stones and the fabric tore open at the seams. The sound cut through the ballroom sharper than any scream could have. Grace stood frozen, one arm instinctively crossing her chest, tears gathering but never falling, her silence somehow filling the room more completely than any outburst would have. Nearby staff members took a half-step forward, torn between protecting a coworker and protecting their jobs, painfully aware that intervening against the girlfriend of the guest of honor could cost them everything. Michael Harrison himself sat rigid in his chair, jaw tightening, aware on some level that what he was witnessing crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, yet held back by the same fear that gripped everyone else in that glittering room, the fear of creating a scene, of embarrassing the wrong person, of choosing decency over convenience. It was in that suspended, breathless silence, with Grace standing exposed and humiliated in the middle of the ballroom floor, that the doors at the far end of the room quietly opened, and a man in a simple navy suit stepped inside without security, without fanfare, without the slightest idea of what he was about to walk into. Nathaniel Brooks had not planned on that ballroom being the setting for one of the most important moments of his life. He had flown back early from California, cutting a business trip short the moment he learned Grace intended to volunteer at that particular gala, hoping to surprise her by joining the charity auction later that evening. He walked in wearing nothing that marked him as anyone important, no bodyguards, no entourage, just a man eager to see his wife across a crowded room. Instead, he found silence so heavy it seemed to physically press against the walls. His eyes found Grace immediately, the way they always did in any room, and what he saw stopped him cold, her torn uniform, her trembling hands, the tears she was fighting so hard to hold back. Something in his expression shifted instantly, the warmth draining into something quieter and far more serious. Without a single word, he crossed the ballroom floor, removed his tailored jacket, and gently wrapped it around her shoulders, shielding her from hundreds of watching eyes. Then he turned to face the room, and one hotel executive, recognizing him immediately, whispered his name loud enough for the tables nearest to hear. That whisper spread like wildfire, table to table, until the entire ballroom understood that the quiet waitress they had all overlooked, the one Vanessa had just torn apart in front of everyone, was married to one of the most respected philanthropists in the country. Vanessa's confidence evaporated in an instant, her mouth opening and closing without sound as the weight of what she had done became horrifyingly clear. Someone quietly explained that Grace was not simply Nathaniel's wife but a driving force behind foundations that had funded children's hospitals and scholarships across the country, some of which had quietly paid for the education of employees standing in that very hotel. Michael Harrison rose to his feet, his face pale with the realization of what his silence had allowed to happen, and in front of every guest he apologized directly to Grace, admitting aloud that true leadership meant protecting people's dignity rather than protecting his own comfort. He ended his public partnership with Vanessa that same night, choosing accountability over convenience for the first time in the entire evening. Yet what followed was not the revenge many guests expected. Nathaniel, who could easily have used his influence to destroy Vanessa's reputation entirely, simply held his wife's hand and thanked the staff who had tried to comfort her. Grace herself asked that no retaliation be taken, explaining gently that humiliation should never be answered with more humiliation, and that she hoped this painful moment could become a lesson in compassion rather than a story of revenge. Her forgiveness moved people in that room to tears, and within days, footage of the incident spread across the country, touching millions who found themselves inspired not by the scandal, but by the quiet strength of a woman who refused to let cruelty change who she was. Businesses began adopting new respect policies for their employees, donations to children's charities surged, and months later, Grace returned to that same hotel wearing the very same uniform, welcomed this time not because of her husband's fortune, but because she had reminded an entire city that true greatness is measured in humility, compassion, and the quiet courage to forgive. If this story moved you, hit that like button, drop a comment telling me what you would have done in that ballroom, and subscribe so you never miss the next story that reminds us what real power actually looks like.